Okay. Yeah.
Sorry, what? No, it's a class kind of. You know, this he's an urbanist.
Mm. Um, but greetings, everyone, wherever you are. My name is Malik Abdoumaliq Simone. I'm um, I'm an urbanist. Um, I largely work geographically for most of my life in different African cities and cities in South and Southeast Asia. Um, what I wanted, I have to say at the beginning that that you have to bear with me a little bit because it is way past midnight where I am. And so it may be a little I may be a little incoherent at moments, but I'll try to make sense most of the time. Um, what I want to do is in these sessions is to take a project that we've been developing in a relationship between the Urban Institute at the University of Sheffield and the Beyond Inhabitation Lab at the Polytechnic University in Turin uh, on Black urbanism, and to use some of these notions from Black urbanism as a way to think through where the city is going, and some as a particular angle on new angles on urban life. And by Black urbanism, what I mean is the ways in which the realities of urban habitation by different Black populations across the world, what those kinds of realities and practices, what kinds of knowledge, what kinds of orientations, what kinds of practices emerge from those kinds of experiences, and how they might be folded into an analytic that might be applicable to think through the ways in which different kinds of urban situations reach toward each other, what they have to offer each other across different geographies, so that it's not in some sense an urbanism that is specific to the particular needs or struggles or experiences of Black populations, but rather how those kinds of experiences that emerge contribute to an analytic that those rethinks across different kinds of urban geographies. So I want to today to just simply show some slides to introduce some of these concepts, some of these notions on extensions. So the notion of extensions is our way of trying to crystallize what those kinds of contributions of Black urbanism constitute. That is a kind of extensionality as a mode of urban existence and operation, and to think through what that might be. And then next time to talk more specifically about Blackness and about Blackness in its relationship to urbanization. And then finally, in the third session, to look at some kinds of interventions, some kinds of actual engagements that try to put these concepts to work in some way. So I want to perhaps then just start with going through some of these concepts, some of these points, and then turn to you and to ask you, to talk about the kinds of things that are of concern to you, what your interests, and so that we can think about more specifically addressing what those are in the subsequent sessions. So I will start. So I want to start with the notion of the city as something that is in some ways broken. That is, conventionally, the city has been seen as a kind of consolidation, as a culmination of particular densities and intersections of various kinds of capacities, of particular kinds of structural processes. So I want to, in some ways, start with the reversal, the inverse of that, and think about the city as broken compacts, broken solidarities, broken connections, broken interdependencies. And thus the importance of then the notion of extensions. And not just in the sense of extended urbanization, which is a notion that is perhaps familiar through the work of Lefebvre, in terms of the way in which urbanization processes extend and reproduce themselves through their own self-perpetuating logic. And to think about extensions not as a kind of fractal replication of format or formula, but extensions as kinds of entanglements, as interminglings, as a way in which different modalities of existence wrap themselves around each other, speak to each other, affect each other. So entanglements of different locations, of different ways of living, different games of getting by, different logics and identities of what any given place might be. And in the literature that I suggested to accompany these discussions. These are certainly the sort of emphases on entanglements, on intermingling, and entanglements and intermingling, not to repair the brokenness, but brokenness as a kind of default condition that suggests its own possible dispositions. That is, rather than seeing brokenness as a kind of problem to be fixed, or as the coming to an end of, or the dysfunctionality of particular relationships. While brokenness may indeed be all of those things, what is it that brokenness itself suggests? What kinds of futures, what kinds of possibilities does the sense of brokenness entail? Just like the famous pictures of plants that emerge from a broken pavement. So in some sense, that extensions is not so much of a place, but a process of extending across various lines of zones, functions, locations, identities, and temporalities. And so these extensions also take place at the level of the body. Bodies that find the effort to stabilize through consolidating place, acquiring assets, maximizing consumption, offer an increasingly limited horizon. Too much labor, too much indebtedness, too much compliance. Who distribute social life and livelihood across multiple locations and opportunities. That is, if in some ways a lot of the biopolitics of the city, a lot of the orientation of policy and livelihood has focused on how do people become settled, how do they consolidate their life in place, how do they stake a claim. How do they carve out a relationship between themselves and place so that that place begins to represent something about who they are? And that place then takes on the characteristics of those that come to settle there. That this kind of consolidation, this kind of inscription in place, in terms of contemporary urban life, and particularly urban life in much of the global South, is being shifted to one of an emphasis on circulation, on movement, about how one distributes oneself, how one distributes one's relationships, one's extended family, one's limited assets, one's time, one's orientation, how this is distributed across multiple locations and opportunities, so that the body itself becomes a kind of vehicle of extending, of extensions. The body extends itself across different kinds of social relationships, across different kinds of locations, across different kinds of games. And this in some ways places the notion of itineraries over the ones of emplacement. So in some ways to find out who someone is and to think about what it is that they are incapable of is less a matter of identifying them with a particular kind of place than it is identifying them across their kinds of itineraries of everyday movement. This doesn't mean that everyone is in some sense free and capable of moving wherever they want. it doesn't mean that people are not in some ways stuck in particular kinds of emplacements. I mean, I know in one of the neighborhoods I grew up as a kid in Englewood in the south side of Chicago. I know today that many kids don't really leave don't really go beyond the kind of 6 square block area. That in some ways there are multiple kinds of confinement. That the carceral, that the notion of being captive and imprisoned isn't just a matter of the prison, but often a matter of being relegated to particular kinds of places where one can feel in some ways operative. So it's not to deny or to mitigate in some sense the importance of such emplacement, either volitional or not volitional, but rather simply to point to a kind of shift underway, a shift of emphasis and orientation. And thus the urban becomes, in some sense, a kind of constant recalibration of movement, and itself constantly recalibrated by movement. Even when people are held in place, and particularly in particular built environments adamantly hold on. So there's something about the complexion of places within urban context where there's a kind where in some areas there's a kind of obdurate holding on of things that seem to never go away, and there are other places where things change so often, really change very, very often. So in some ways, endurance, the ability to keep going, is less a function of cemented ties, of a particular kind of relationship to people, to place, but a continuous repositioning of a place, whether it's a factory, a tea stall, a restaurant, a house, to a shifting realignment of broken details. So in some ways that this raises the question is what kind of a frame is able to hold together all of the different kinds of elements of urban life. There are certainly forms of calculation, forms of governance, increasingly algorithmically centered, that try to cement and to assess particular relationships between all kinds of heterogeneous and disparate aspects of urban life. The relationship between local finance and transportation patterns and household livelihoods. And so that in some ways there are these sort of modes of calculation which attempt to constitute a kind of frame which attempts to hold all of these heterogeneities together in some kind of proportionality, some kind of sense of mutual causation. But at the same time, those kinds of frames, that kind of overarching sense of coherence, is something that is also put into increasing question, as the kind of overall sense of how people are connected to each other begins to often dissipate. As we well know, I mean, in terms of urban life, what is it that holds people together? What is it that becomes a kind of viable locus of connection when consumption, accumulation, everyday living becomes increasingly individuated and individualistic? So extensions are, in one sense, include a sense of intense artificiality. It's not the model of organic communities. It's not the resolution of conflicting tenure regimes and practices and agendas. But rather, when we talk about extensions, it's the simultaneous existence of these differences of technical artifacts rather than social representations per se, like the artifice of hair extensions. When someone puts extensions in their hair, it is a kind of technical artifice to, in some sense, redesign the image of the body, but yet it's sometimes looking as if it is something that is natural. And so, in some ways, the way in which extensions are oftentimes ones of prothesis, the add-ons, the kinds of technical capacities which increase the ability of human life and human cognition to do things. Extensions are also infrastructural, the way in which particular kinds of delivery, of providing services, providing capacity happens through the extensions of existing kinds of grids. Extensions also are a kind of technicity of different kinds of games that people play in order to draw attention to themselves, games to make claims, games to obtain attention, games to make themselves known, games that people engage in order to be noticed, to enable themselves to be recognized, to be taken seriously, games that enable people to be folded in, invited in to other people's agendas, to have a kind of position, to have a kind of opportunity. All of these in some ways are a process of extensionality. And so in some ways, if one considers the city as a consolidation of propertied land, of property, of populations with individuated properties that are demonstrated through citizenship, of densified spatial functionalities, economic aggrandizement, and the maximization of value-added activity. If all of these are sort of the common characteristics of city life, of the kind of relations of property, of citizenship, of spatial density, of spatial definition, of function, of the way in which different kinds of economic activities are interconnected, the way in which land, the value of land is maximized by, for example, building vertically, building huge condos, huge mega developments. If all of these kinds of things have in some ways defined the city, the way in which these things are extended is not so much in their fractal replication. It's not just so much repeating them as the city expands out into its hinterlands. It is partly that, but it's also in some ways the way in which the way in which these factors begin to consolidate the city are themselves abrupted, the way in which they are changed, the way in which they are modified, the way in which they are subject to a certain upheaval, as the very way in which the urban begins to extend itself. So in some ways, expansion isn't simply, and growth isn't simply the repetition of things. It's not simply a kind of the expansionist of the same kind of logic, but rather that these extensions take place in some ways through beginning to be able to rearrange these kinds of processes in different ways. And I'll get to that in a little bit. And all of this is then coupled with, you know, what Vero Gago is fond of saying in terms of generalized plunder, always a kind of theft of orientation through the seemingly extensions of extended debt. For example, where I am at the moment, there's a very concerted attempt to break up many different kinds of popular working poor, working class neighborhoods that were based on the way in which people had each other. What they had was they had each other. They had the possibility of negotiating everyday life with each other. They had the possibility of sharing resources, of engaging in complementary different kinds of activities, certain kinds of solidarity. And the way in which the state begins to try to break up those kinds of territories through, in some ways, plundering their lives in a way, a kind of theft of their capacities by luring them into new residential situations of so-called affordable housing, where, for example, no money down, 20 different kinds of payment plans, but yet people are then in some ways enrolled in a process of always paying off the debt. They will never stop paying. And so this is a kind of theft of orientation, that in some ways people's capacities to negotiate particular dispositions of the city, that those capacities are in some sense plundered in terms of enrolling them in a process of endless indebtedness. So in some ways, the terrain on which justice is to be done, and there's always this sense of what is the just city, what is a sense of urban justice, would seem to entail removing any impediments that foreclosed longevity to the oppressed and condemned them to a slow death. So there are always, in some sense, struggles in some ways to provide people with better livelihoods, better opportunities for self-determination, for a way in which they can participate in the design and the governance of their own territories of life. And to a large extent, this is exactly what justice is. But I'm interested in the question that Fred Moten raises, is not so much whether justice is done through such an orientation, but rather the extent to which our ideas of justice, how applicable are they to the ways in which the eruption of normative trajectories, the way in which the tumultuous spilling of life in wayward, inexplicable ways is both the product of subjugation and of life's priority, and that is sometimes impossible to navigate this distinction. In other words, what the question that Moten is posing here is, what is it about, in some sense, urban life, which is increasingly subjected to calculation, increasingly subjected to the maximization of value, not just the value of land, but the value of individual lives, the way in which the kinds of ideas and practices and socialities of of even the most marginal of urban residents can be used as a way to service what would be considered lives worth living, which normatively are considered ones that are always in the process of being developed. A life always under development, always trying to achieve new kinds of capacities, new kinds of skills, new education, new kinds of consumptions, new kinds of abilities. The way in which that so many dimensions of urban life become increasingly a product of intensive calculation. And that in response to this, that somehow to not be captive to this is always to find ways in which that the way in which urban residents now attempt to extend themselves beyond a certain kind of making themselves visible, extending themselves beyond simply the declaration, this is who I am, this is where I belong, these are my aspirations, this is what I want to do, this is what I want to become, and to make that known in very definitive ways. That increasingly also the urban becomes an arena where people try to dispense with those kinds of representations, those kinds of declarations, those kinds of orientations, and find ways of, in some sense, being all over the place, of using the kind of processes of urbanization as a kind of platform of invention and experimentation, even if it's within very limited sense of working with the few materials you have and doing something completely unprecedented and different with it. Just to give you an example, one of the neighborhoods that I work in Jakarta is renowned for people propositioning each other. And propositioning each other not in terms of a sexual proposition, but on the street in everyday life, always seeming to be making outrageous suggestions about where one can find, if you go to the corner and if you bring a bottle of water to the woman sitting there, and you read these few lines to her, she might be able to tell you where you can get a 50% discount on a bag of rice. And then you go there, and then you're passed along to another market, or always residents in some ways making sort of outrageous propositions about certain kinds of possibilities. One saw this in some ways in the pandemic period. For example, friends of mine described in Mumbai at a time where people were looking for canisters of oxygen, that it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what position you had, it didn't matter who your networks were, it didn't matter how much money you had. Everyone was scrambling for those canisters, and your particular kind of position within a particular hierarchy didn't give you any particular advantage. It was this sort of wild exchange of messages on what's up group, and all of a sudden people would discover 50 canisters in the back of a stall in a market selling cloth, and people would rush there, and they would be gone, and they would get a message about other places where you might find them. And so in some ways, this is what I mean by the kind of tumultuous spilling out of life in wayward, inexplicable ways. And in some ways, what Fred Moten is trying to say is that this is both a product of subjugation and of life's priority. and that it's sometimes difficult to navigate what that distinction is. So this intricate weave of seeming contradictions and effective intensities of giving out is posited then as an underlining of what I call the urban extensions. Now, on the one hand, these extensions represent something that is always in upheaval and unsettling, a foregrounding of an excess of artifice, something unnatural and disruptive of whatever appears organic, where consensus is foreclosed and whatever coordination ensues is premised more on strange alliances, the coming together of things that seemingly don't belong. On the other hand, extensions entail acts of compassion, a lending of hands that do not incur debt, that don't require precise recognition of those to whom a hand is lent, nor the instantiation of the morality, law, or agendas of the lender, where nothing is owed or anticipated in a space that can be both liminal or nothing whatsoever. So both notions of extensions, that which is a kind of process of unsettling, of strange alliances that never seem to be institutionalized, never seem to be settled, and extensions as a kind of extending oneself, a kind of act of compassion. Both of these are at work in the feral landscapes of many, many neighborhoods, particularly across the urban South, in the dense intermixture of a decline in ascendancy, commerce and residence, and the shatterscot contiguities of seemingly everything in the hinterlands of urban regions. So in some ways, extensions are not just a kind of location. It's not a particular geography of the city, but rather it is the coming together of this sense of both unsettling and of giving out, of giving out without the requirement of debt, that show up in different ways across different aspects of urban life. So these extensions, they upend the ontological dispositions of the city. That is, they throw into question the city's always conceit to crystallize human potency to arrange natures, the city's claim to embody the will of free individuals. Extensions are speculative futurisms in that they constitute alternative readings of what might take place within a specific order of things. So the city has always been, or the predominant readings of the city have always been preoccupied with settlement. Even while there's been a lot of focus in urban studies on mobility, so as to counter the dominance of this preoccupation, I think there remains a kind of underappreciation of the way in which movement takes place. Now, people have always moved. And instead of seeing movement simply as a descriptor of transport and conveyance, or the activity entailed in shifting bodies from one location to another, human movement is consonant with the fact that all matter constantly moves. And here the work of Karen Barad is maybe perhaps particularly cogent. So whatever stabilization indeed emerges is not the cessation of movement, but rather the capacity of things to move with and through each other. The ways in which the conventional holds, institutions, sites are extended into a series of middle spaces which do not belong to anywhere specific, but yet can act specifically to gather up different sentiments and ways of doing things in experimental ways. So in some sense, this notion of being unsettled comes. I don't want to make this kind of unsettling process something that is overly romantic. I mean, it is difficult to be unsettled. It is difficult to not have some kind of anchorage. And we know in some ways the way in which a lot of the urban economy operates these days is through very precarious labor, the platform labor, where things are always being unsettled, where the drivers, the deliverers, are always in some sense in a process of being unsettled, and increasingly the way in which precarity describes short-term employment without contract, or the need to always be involved in continuous training in order to keep up, the way in which the distinctions between work and non-work are always blurred. So precarity is a kind of omnipresent reality of much of contemporary labor and contemporary residence. But also unsettling operates as a kind of urban architecture that pushes residents into new arrangements of living and income generation, with a kind of presumption that things won't last for very long. And so in many instances, its institutions are not being built, but rather they're always in some sense temporary arrangements whose experimental nature is driven more by the inability to assume a normal life than a progressive imagination. And so in some sense, this unsettling is an ability to jump scale, to bring together innovative connections amongst media, materials, cultural norms, and physical settings. And money is less the creation of a new collective sensibility than a kind of series of tactical improvisations in the midst of sociality falling apart, being dissolved into an expanding archive of details strewn across vast distances and not really distant given the reach of social media. So the sense of extensions that I'm trying to grapple with here is the real difficulty of unsettling, the real precarity involved in the kind of unsettling of the way in which people have attempted to anchor themselves, to belong, to consolidate some kind of viable life for themselves. But unsettling also is a kind of generative process, a way in which everything is sort of tossed in the air. And what happens within those kinds of moments of suspension, ways in which things can witness and reach and open themselves up and to pay attention and interact with each other in unprecedented ways that won't find a kind of deep institutional form. They might not last for very long, but yet they do create a kind of new sensibility, a new sense of being in the city. And so the notion of extensions is in some ways in which those two different notions of unsettlement attempt to, in some ways, reach toward each other. What are the kinds of connections entailed in this? It's in some ways the similar notion with dispossession. We know that in some ways people are in cities are frequently dispossessed of their land, dispossessed of their social intimacies, dispossessed of viable employment, dispossessed of jobs that they had for long periods of time. And so dispossession oftentimes then raises the question of what does repossession mean? And oftentimes repossession carries with it still this sense of property, to repossess, to rehold on, to re-anchor, to reestablish. And not that that's not important. It is important. But in some ways, the capacity to move on, of invention, of trying to figure out new ways of doing things, itself requires a dispossession. To be dispossessed of that which is familiar, to be dispossessed of the kinds of belongings, the kinds of elements through which you identify yourself, how you are productively dispossessed of these things. So one is situated in the midst of this kind of tension, of this kind of ambiguity. So the urban extensions, in some sense, are characterized by an incessant, an ongoing rearrangement of spatial products, their form, their functions, and their valuations. And rearrangements that in the process of taking form then would seem to at least confound the existing capacities to make things count in one way or the other. Again, during the pandemic period, I was coordinating a kind of a monthly discussion of colleagues that were urban researchers in 35 cities across the South. And what everyone was saying about their experiences of working with the communities and institutions, which was their work during the pandemic, was the way in which things were being rearranged. The notion of the household, that in some sense the pandemic became a kind of a window to the extent to which it was very clear the way in which households in many cities have nothing to do with who lives in a particular home, that the household is not something that was in some sense defined by kin, defined by, mother, father, children, aunts, grandfather. But the household was something much more malleable, much more extensive, much more a process of how things were continuously rearranged, how a sense of mutual responsibility and intimacy took place not between a defined set of characters, but was always being in some ways circulated, rearranged amongst a shifting set of actors, both in terms of who were proximate and those that weren't. And that under lockdown, when states ordered that people were to remain in the house, that households were to remain within the household, that so many people didn't have the sense of being with the household when they were in the house, that somehow there was a kind of cut, and those that they were living with were somehow that kind of arrangement was in some sense inexplicable to them in some ways. They also talked about all the ways in which schools became dormitories, the way in which markets became important kinds of fora of political decision making. So this sense of rearrangement, that those things that we associate with a particular kind of identity and function, were able to always shift, or the way in which those kinds of institutions and locations were revealed to not be what we might have thought that they were. So rearrangements in the process of taking form seem to at least confound the existent capacities to make things count in one way or another. Now, relations are inevitable. Nothing is one thing, and the only thing that's one thing is nothing. So things are always to be added and subtracted and multiplied, as everything is more or less something else. But is this oscillating, sliding rearrangement necessarily tied to specific values, especially as the continuous running of algorithmic relations eventually exceed anything that can be defined? So how to detach from the hold of weighted numbers? That is, again, this sense that this sense of the kind of weight and the domination of evaluation, of assigning particular kind of value to things. And Denise Ferreira da Silva talks about the notion of differences without separability, differences that are simply differences, differences that can't be apportioned in any particular schema of the more or less valuable or the more or less relatable, where there is no other that constitutes the ground for a delimited view of worthiness or eligibility. So in some sense, this is that this notion of rearranging is in this sense of differences without separability. Or what has oftentimes been called inoperable relations. Guys are like eruptions, even whose specific location and force of discharge can never be known in advance, of inclinations, of long histories of experiments, conjunctions, mutual projects, sometimes amongst unwitting participants, that seem to intentionally avoid assuming the form where they would be subject to political contestation or empirical verification. Relations proposed that are detached from obvious genealogy, that compress things conventionally viewed as impossible to be together, and that have no way of knowing whether they will endure or not. In other words, the technical dimensions of the relationalities of urbanization come from all over the place and work in different degrees, proportions, and manifestations that come to be associated with it, but that also don't intrinsically belong to it. That is, relations of which it's very difficult to provide a kind of empirical evidence in some ways that are able to trace the way in which they affect each other. But if you think of the way, if you take a particular neighborhood and you think of all that takes place right now, the arguments in the kitchen, the kind of kids playing on the street next door, the way in which someone is in someone's on the phone with someone, hundreds of miles away, the way in which there is a kind of meeting taking place, or a prayer group across the street, or people eating in a restaurant down the block. These are all simultaneities. And one might think, okay, the only discernible, the only recognizable relationships amongst all these things is that they happen to take place within the same kind of geographical area. That's the only way that we can tie them together. But in what ways do they affect each other? What ways in which there are lines that one can draw between all of these very disparate relationships? That there's simultaneity, the fact that they're taking place all right now. What way might we think that in some ways they affect each other, affect and are affected by each other? What are those kinds of lines of connection? I mean, it's impossible to think of a kind of method that would empirically prove particular kinds of notions of causation, that would really prove that somehow this is a kind of network of intersections. But in some ways, if one thinks about all that transpires in urban life, it is not just the discernible, it is not just the recognizable, it's not just the way in which we order things. I mean, we depend, for example, on the technical apparatuses of infrastructure as a way to, in some ways, think through those kinds of connections. This is the road that goes from here to there. These are the kinds of pipes and the lines and the broadband. These are all of the kinds of technical affordances of the city that facilitate a sense of connectivity through infrastructure, through these kinds of ways of structuring the material flows that we need in order to materially survive within urban conditions. Infrastructure at times provides the map. But are there other forms of the infrastructural, of the infrapolitical, ways that might that in some ways provide a kind of map, a kind of sensibility through which in some ways people are able to navigate and think through and sense their lives in ways which are not in some sense subject to particular kinds of valuation, particular kinds of categorization. So this is what I mean, that in some way that the technical dimensions of relationalities of urbanization come from all over the place, that they work in different degrees and proportions and manifestations that come to be associated with it, but don't intrinsically belong to it. And then I have some materials here about, in some sense, how this notion of extensions perhaps operates in what are, in some ways, places within the city that are known as the extensions, the extensions of the city, the far suburbs, the periphery, the hinterlands. But before I do this, in some sense, I would be interested in hearing from you, who you are, what you're doing, what kinds of things are important to you, get a sense of what you're thinking. So I would prefer to maybe stop now and get a sense for you to take some time to say something about these things. So who would like to start? Okay. Is it Jorge?
Hi, Professor. You hear me?
Yeah.
Great. It's because sometimes there's interference. Uh, well, my name is Jorge Campos. We have met before last year when you presented also a brief introduction of Black urbanism. At the time, I was in Berbera in Somaliland. And I
Yeah.
recall because you told me that you had worked there as well. Well, now I'm taking a little break from Somaliland and I'm just here in Nairobi, which is also a great place to get a close look at the kinds of processes and improvisations that you are describing here. But well, as I mentioned last time, my research focuses on processes of appropriation and ownership in the entanglement precisely between statecraft, fiscality, and the logistical economy that is emerging in Berbera. So I want to see how these three, let's say, vectors or lines of force uh, form new platforms of property, of what I'm calling appropriation and ownership, in different aspects of urban life. So what I'm trying to do right now is determine what aspects of urban life I'm going to be focusing on. Is it going to be small investments by traders that are encouraged by these new logistical developments to expand their business? Is it the kind of corporate life that is developing in Berbera because more people are going into the logistical economy and having a more powerful leverage to negotiate with the state? Is it the kind of composition of profit that the DP World investment struggles to create? Because even as a corporate actor, they do have to negotiate with certain unexpected instances of urban life, particularly in Berbera. So I'm in the midst of this formulation of the project, but those are the elements that gather my attentiveness: state, fiscality, logistical economy, entangled in the forms of property that are giving new moral formations, a distinctive aspect to this side of urban life in the Horn. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. I do have a couple of questions of what you just presented to us, but perhaps I can wait until the rest of the people get a chance to speak, and then I'll raise the questions later.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is Renzo, you want to?
Sure, thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. That's always one of the worries with these online meetings. So, as you can see, my name is Renzo Baas. I'm a fellow at the Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence in the Bavarian town of Bayreuth. And the project that I'm looking at is what I would term speculative spatiality. So delving into African and Afro-diasporic science fiction and speculative fiction with the kind of focus on how I would say Black futures are imagined with a kind of urban component. So I'm from literary studies, and a lot of the novels that I'm looking at also take place within urban settings. So one of the main ones is Lagos, for example, but you also have Dahlgren, which has a very kind of interesting urban dynamic where we have this kind of decayed post-apocalyptic urban setting, and looking at how not only blackness features in this, but also the kind of more than human aspect of that, plus questions around kinship, around relations, relationality, etc. So those are the kind of things I'm currently focusing on. With having said that, I'm not from or connected to urban studies, so this is also something that's quite new to me, and that therefore I'm quite interested in the sessions that we'll be having together.
And Rusbach?
Yes, Ruzbe. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, hi. I just wanted to say before introducing Steph that I can do this on other times if the time is not working for you. For me, it's like early evening, so it's possible. And yeah, I'm flexible on that. But I'm a PhD candidate in Leiden University. I'm doing history, basically, cultural history. My initial proposal was to study a library, a cultural institution in Iran during the 60s, established during the 60s, but it's working now and become national. Library, especially for children and young adults. And they did art workshops and many art activities. So my main question was at that point, why this concern with the idea of productive leisure time appeared at that point, and what was what it took that form in that specific form as a cultural institutions besides schools, and what was the effects, what sort of reaction children had, what did they produce. Yeah, and I think maybe I'm also more broadly interested in the effects of modernization on children, and again how they did respond to that. And I don't know, like the context, could be, I mean, it's urban, but also I'm reading things from very rural towns and villages, and this library existed in this. And one of the things that they were proud of was they're trying to bring books to very remote areas in Iran. Yes, so it's more for me was to have new ways of reading and writing history, or looking at the past. So I think, and also just personal interest in the discussions. I think I live in Rotterdam, and it's in the south of Rotterdam that is being gentrified in its own way. So that was also, it's also a contemporary, I think, present concern. So that's it.
Yeah. No, I've been in the last couple of days, I've been really interested in the manifestation of kids, that and trying to think through sometimes what it is their orientation to urban conditions. That I mean, where I am now is going through a really very difficult moment. But almost every kid that you run into everywhere has this thing that they hold with two balls on a string. And the idea is to position it in such a way as to get the balls to collide and then automatically go back and forth with each other, and it makes this kind of clicking sound all the time. Every kid you see, every kid from like 2 to like everywhere, thousands and thousands of them constantly have them in their hands. And I kept wondering, what are these kids? I mean, you know that at times these kinds of obsessions come, that these things become, particular game become popular, but the soundscape is such that you wonder sometimes, what are they trying to say in a way, or what are they saying? What is this? What is a kind of collective choir of kids in some ways trying to do by virtue of this kind of and it just makes one think that in some ways it is sometimes kids' presence within urban life that oftentimes gets ignored or disattended to. And so it's really interesting about
Sure.
yeah. Yeah. So Jorge, did you want to come in with your questions?
Sure, Professor. I think there's another participant who has not spoken yet, isn't it?
Oh, I don't.
Yes, it's me. It's me. Sorry.
I believe it's
Oh.
Do you hear
yeah.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I've been a bit almost half engaged only this lecture. I had some other works I had to get done as well. But my name is Marta, and I'm a doctoral student of philosophy in Riga, Latvia. And I am in my dissertation. I am working on the topic of exclusion and inclusion in the modern society, and specifically from biopolitical and ethical aspect. And so this it's a the topic seemed already from the beginning quite wide, large for me, but it grows even bigger as I am working on it. But so I start seeing this theme almost almost in every other theme. So and this course caught my attention because one of the parts in my dissertation is on the community and collaboration in urban setting, and how individuals and communities live together and form and dwell and so on. And this yeah, well, I thought this, and it's a part of my dissertation I haven't really started working on seriously, and it seemed this course could somehow give some, yeah, like a push for me to start thinking about that part, and also give some more maybe like real world material, and bring me more into like real world, thinking about the world as it is in experience of people and communities around the world now, because I've been dealing with theoretical and ontological questions until now. So yeah.
So where are the communities that you are working with?
Well, I am not really working with the communities, but I am looking at relationships between individuals in a community, and I've been dealing with this mostly from a theoretical point of view, and well, some authors I'm dealing with in the dissertation are like Roberto Esposito and Giorgio Agamben and Richard Sennett and others. So
Okay.
yeah, I haven't been working with some empirical material much. Yeah, so that's why I thought this would yeah, add something to my work.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank
So
you.
Jorge, do you want to? Yeah.
Sure, Professor. Actually, my questions are, to a certain extent, very self-serving, because I do see how this framework of Black urbanism could help me illuminate some of what is going on in Berbera. So the first question is pretty straightforward, is what is the role of property in the framework? Like, what are the realities of appropriation and ownership? You did mention something about the stabilization of certain extensions, which seem to raise at least three questions, like why an extension obtains, for how long, and to what consequences. That's how I would interrogate the notion of extension as far as I understand it. But I would like you to comment a little bit more with that kind of conceptual formulation and the notion of property. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that it's way beyond the notion of a bundle of rights, and like we are in another completely different league when it comes to thinking about property. But what role does it play within Black urbanism? So that's the first question on property. And then the second question is, which of course the whole lecture was precisely about this, which is distinguishing the particularity of the notion of extension vis-a-vis, for instance, an entanglement, vis-a-vis, for instance, the old idea of hybridities, vis-a-vis the Marxist notion of articulation. So I think we have been for some time, at least from anthropology, that's where I'm from, we have been thinking about how to describe or depict the encounter between two seeming different entities. And we have come to realize that this is actually immanently emergent in the encounter. So how do you differentiate the notion of extension from these that we've had in previous generations, like hybridity, articulation, and so on?
Okay. Yeah, those are really important. Those are really important questions. In terms of property, I mean, at a very small scale, the part of the notion of one of the limitations of the notion of property is that in some ways it conflates concepts of freedom with those of property. So one in some ways discovers a sense of autonomous action through the management of one's property, and that one has to subject property to a kind of process of continuous development, but also to development that in some ways reinforces the boundedness and the separation of that property from other kinds of territory and locations. And in some ways, that is a kind of limiting. It is in some ways full of certain kinds of tensions. Because on the one hand, to enforce separability is a kind of violence. It is, the cut always has to be in some ways reinforced through a cutting off of other kinds of potential uses, other kinds of access, other kinds of engagements. But how do you develop property without those very kinds of engagements? So in some ways, the development process itself becomes one of a kind of a reification, a kind of choking off, a kind of freedom through choking off the possibilities of having that property, whatever you do, extending outward and being a kind of affordance, being a kind of connector, being a kind of resource to others and their initiatives and their territories. So in some ways, those kinds of tensions then get exhibited or dealt with in a variety of different kinds of ways. Now, historically, in many cities, the way in which this has been done is, in some sense, to take property and to divide it. You have a plot of land, and you divide it. And so the division, in some sense, is not just a way of maximizing the kind of value you can get from that property by selling it or renting it out to others, but it is in some ways incorporating, ingesting the kinds of capacities and resources and ideas of other people's inhabitation of that property into one's own as a way in which to attempt to make it resourceful, in a way to make it developed. That's one way. But again, it's a kind of inward folding in movement. The others are all these sort of attempts to test out the notion of the boundary. For example, in some neighborhoods I've worked with, people are always making quite literal extensions of the building, of the house, of the property into areas of some kind of ambiguity. You make a kind of extension of a stall where you sell some drink or you sell some food, or you build on to something as a way in which, like in the famous book by, what is her name, Adeline Mascalier in Niamey, where she talks about this notion of the fada, where the youth will build an extension of the compound out onto the street as their own kind of place of hanging out, of reflection, as a move away from the household, now into the kind of public world, but a public world where their generational status as youth still doesn't really value them. So it becomes an interstitial space where they attempt to figure out with each other a kind of intermediation between the household and the larger public through the concrete extension of this kind of barrack that comes out into the... But it also raises the question, is this extension part of the household compound, or is it part of the kind of public street? And there are all kinds of conflicts and debates and compromises around that kind of small kind of extension. But then there are other kinds of extensions related to property, which in some sense fold in different kinds of logics in a way in which it is. So, for example, major developers will have land bank, significant plots of land at the outskirts of the city, which they hold. So usually, for example, if you have a large plot of land on the outskirts of the city, usually the operative policies will be, if you want to hold on to that, you have to develop it within a certain period of time, 5 to 10 years. You have to do something with it. So oftentimes major developers will get around this by maintaining the land as a platform for peasant agriculture. So people will continue to farm that land for free, but in return, the developer maintains an exception on the need to turn it into a kind of development within 5 to. So you have a folding in of different kinds of, they extend themselves to each other. The peasant agriculture and the corporate developer, their logics in some ways intersect for the time being, provisionally, in the maintenance of kind of peasant agriculture on land that they don't own, but that they don't pay, they're not obligated to pay for anything. They in some ways keep they keep the crop, and because it's agricultural purposes, that developer doesn't have to pay taxation on it. So you have these kinds of extensions of different kinds of logics of land use and property that for the moment provide a kind of ambiguous disposition. And then you have and then you have you have in many different cities, for example, the possibility of 7 to 10 people perhaps forming a kind of trust. That is, the trust, the land is put within a kind of trust, a kind of mutual ownership. And this way, they could possibly consolidate individual plots into a larger piece of land, provide a kind of apartment for themselves, and rent out the others in terms, and that rent goes into the kind of the trust rather than in the individual ownership. But then there's the capacity of there's the problem of what would enable them to do that. What kind of location? Where is it? How accessible is it? What can they? Then there is the in many cities the ambiguity between land that is registered and land that remains unregistered. And what is the status of unregistered land, and who and what kind of claims can be made on it? And for example, in many of the kind of peripheral regions of large urban areas, there are large swathes of land that are unregistered, according to the cadastral of the state. It doesn't mean that there are not multiple claims of ownership. There are multiple claims of ownership. People will have a document from, say, the colonial period that was issued, in 1901, and then there was like bills of sales that are passed down that someone claims to have. So how is this sorted through? And so there's special facilities that look through all the documents, and without any real legal grounding, will make a determination that the land now should be used for this purpose, under this auspices, under this control, wading through very disparate kinds of documents and claims. And so in some ways, and what they and those that read those documents, what they usually do is in some sense is that they will extend the investigation into different forms. Some of them will conduct oral histories. Some of them will go to different kinds of local authorities. Some way, and so the resolution of this is a negotiated one amongst a very disparate group of characters that in some sense then determine the way. And so the determination of ownership is not in some sense the purview of a particular kind of jurisdiction or a particular kind of definitive reading, but rather extends itself out through multiple different kinds of conversations with different kinds of authorities. And those kinds of conversations are then, it's like it's almost as if it's like within different aspects of Somalia where the final resolution of land oftentimes becomes a kind of matter of almost a kind of sauceral position of looking through documents and of. So in some ways, this again, this notion of property is really an important one, but the way in which extensions relate to it might happen in many different kinds of ways. And then the trade-offs that are involved. For example, the way in which air rights are sold. So the ability to exceed the normal zoning regulations that regulate how high a building can go. Oftentimes, air rights, the ability to build beyond a certain level, story, say the regulation says you can't go beyond 20 stories in a particular district. So the exemptions are sold, you know, the exemption, this abstract notion of 15 extra floors that don't exist, that is in some sense conceptualized as property to be sold in return for that developer creating new properties for example, low-income housing in a different part of. So somehow there's a connection made between an abstract notion of 20 extra stories and a certain kind of building of 100 different low-income houses somewhere else that becomes equivalent in a way, given this kind of so there are these ways in which the notion of extensionality operates in multiple ways to both attempt to resolve contradictions within the notion of property, to extend what property means, but also in some ways to try to upend the kind of domination of property as a kind of individualistic form of urban inhabitation. Then there was a second, the second question again. I'm sorry, I forgot, Jorge. There was a second.
So, Doctor, and also, I mean, if you wish, we can address it the next time. It was just a question about the how the notion of extension provides us with a different kind of set of questions to ask that we didn't have before, with notions like entanglement, hybridity, articulation. But it's becoming really clear with this example you just used to answer the first question. So if you wish, I would be completely happy if we address it at some other moment.
Okay, because we're gonna have to come to a close now, but let me just say that this is a really interesting question. My understanding would be that, for example, notions of hybridity are a way of bringing together particular kinds of entities that are in some ways already known. And so you take those that are known and you intermingle them in a way to create a kind of disposition which maybe you don't have a language for yet. Maybe it's not clear what it is that hybrid is or what it does. Maybe you don't know the proportions of how much A contribute to this and B contributed to this, but in some ways you start with a kind of notion of discernible identities or entities that enter into the mix. With extensionality in some ways is a way of crossing things in ways in which it's not, in ways in which the components are not necessarily clearly identified in advance. It is the kind of modality of reaching. It is the modality of the intermingling itself, which in some ways is trying to understand what it is that it does without necessarily the starting point is that you're mixing white and black, A and B, water and salt, but rather a sense of a plane of intermingling, a topological plane of things being reformed, rearranged, reconverted in a way in which you lose the sense of having to necessarily work with clearly distinguished proportions and weighted values. It would be my sense of things. It's like a place in which I lived for several years, which was a kind of major housing development, 22 buildings, each 30 stories high. In some ways, it could be considered a hybrid, because in a way in which it was state subsidized, developer led, it was a way in which all kinds of different monies were involved, all different kinds of residents came to live there. There were flats that were owned. There were flats that were across from me that were rented out by the day. The ones that were rented out by the month on one side of me. On the other side, it was rented out by the week. Every conceivable disposition was compressed in that project. But in a way it provided in this city a kind of residential possibility that was unprecedented. Why? Because it compressed within itself so many different kinds of formalities, informalities, so many different kinds of brokers, so many different kinds of money, so many different kinds of ways in which people group their money together. They occupied individual flats. What they did was to tear down the walls. They made collective living spaces. In some ways, here the hybrid was a form where you couldn't identify the elements. They were compressed together, and in that compression, allowed for a kind of extending this kind of possibility to provide a kind of residential situation for queer people, for radical Muslims, for Somali refugees, for individuals, for families, that was in some ways unprecedented. So in this way, I'm trying to get it to extensions as a kind of mode of operation in which things, the possibility of thinking the way in which things can be connected to each other, that operates beyond our ability really to account for them or to categorize them. In brief, in brief.
Thank you so much for that very thorough answer, Professor. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. So I think we'll leave it there for well, this morning, tonight, this afternoon, wherever you are. Again, thanks for your patience for my post-midnight ramblings, but have a good week, everyone, and take good care of yourselves, all right?
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you, Professor. You too.
Yeah. Ciao. Yeah.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.